Himiko Toga not only just professed her love for Deku, but also just asked him to be her boyfriend in the midst of this ever-hectic battlefield. And so we now find ourselves with Deku, the ninth and proposed to be final user of One For All, the greatest heroic asset in this battle, and the vessel of the quirk that the nefarious All For One most desires and has spent several decades preparing things across the globe to ensure his acquisition of it. This oh so important person who, despite having encountered Toga on a multitude of occasions at this point, had never been confessed to so emotionally in his life, and never for a second even imagined that Toga liked him. So at this moment, Deku would repeat and question her words. Boyfriend? You see, Deku never let his incredible powers get to his head in this sense, and regardless of where he went in terms of being at the #1 hero school in the country, or what powers he had, Deku at the end of the day still regarded himself to be a loser. Which goes to show just how damaging Bakugo's treatment of him was regardless of his repentance, but I digress. So now flustered and blushing, Deku would yell out, questioning what in the world Toga was even talking about, and Toga too was blushing. She would then repeat her statement about loving him, but also elaborate by saying that she'd loved him ever since they first met, which if you remember was during the Forest Training arc, after he had just finished his back and forth struggle against Muscular and was on Shoji's back. And from that time, Toga remembered Deku being so incredibly beat up. And this reminded her of her first love, as he looked exactly like him. And yeah, he absolutely does, to the point where I have to wonder if Deku's father Hisashi actually went abroad for work, or had another broad and made it work with her, because that resemblance is uncanny. Toga would then suddenly exclaim that Deku is just so cool, just like you should suddenly drop a like and subscribe. Toga's admiration here was deranged. She wanted to become Deku, and so she requested that he let her suck his blood. Now Toga has expressed some pretty insane faces over the course of the series, but I definitely think that this is now one of the top ones, goodness gracious. But to this, Deku would respond by expressing his idea of what a couple looks like, envisioning two people holding hands and going to an amusement park together, sharing crepes, which had Uraraka nearby just shaking, as yeah, these are all things that to some degree might just point in her direction. Previously, when it came to the UA School Festival, Uraraka expressed her desire towards getting crepes, and despite doing so individually, Deku was present within the very same shot of this enactment, in the midst of what was essentially an amusement park. They have also recently held hands, certainly not in a romantic sense, but when assisting Deku with his return to the school, Uraraka did so to reassure him. And I will say that this is an interesting prospect. Because of how shonen stories tend to be, never truly being forward in their tackling of romance, we may very well receive visuals of Deku and Uraraka doing this sort of thing at the end of the series as opposed to being an outright declaration. And although I do believe it is a bit tired to allude to romantic interest only to never really touch upon it until the end of the series, where there is no time to actually provide any depth to said relationship, I do think that it could be pretty neat. However, Toga's personal conceptualization of a couple was rather different. To her, such a relationship meant being one and the same, questioning if that makes sense as nothing else would fulfill her desires. So yeah, Toga's idea of a relationship is heavily skewed towards her own dangerous fantasies. Yet what's fascinating about this to me is that Toga's idea of being one and the same appears to only be skin deep. I mean, come on, it's not as if when she turned into Uraraka during My Villain Academia that she upheld the core values of the character or anything like that. No, she just slaughtered everyone with her quirk, which Uraraka later condemned. And so with that in mind, disregarding the fact that her outlook is inherently twisted, it straight up does not even have any substance or weight behind it to begin with. But with yet another near high-end Nomu-induced impact on the way, Toga would ask Deku a question. What do you want to do to me? A question she had previously asked of Uraraka when they met during the first war. And this to me is such an odd question to ask. It is one of those questions I would probably respond to with a question myself, wondering what the person means in this context. But on account of the Nomu's onslaught, Deku had lost visuals on Toga and no longer knew her location, as he now wondered where she was. Now because Toga could so easily mask her presence from him, the likelihood of Deku dominating the battle was rather low. However, the Nomu's attacks were ones that Deku was able to easily evade on account of his danger sense, and so he did, while also admitting that he also wanted to become as strong as All Might back in the day. And with that in mind, he could relate to the feeling of wanting to be like someone else and how fulfilling it may be for the heart. And at this point, with Danger Sense failing to uncover her in the slightest, Deku would come to the conclusion that Toga was the natural counter to the quirk. Deku initially admitted, however, that he doubts he two could ever become one and the same, as he had never once thought about harming the people he cares about like that. And to this, Toga would have that same pained expression on her face as she did when Uraraka rejected her. And yet again, it's a bit difficult to know what this character really wants. Like sure, she is relatively irrational on account of her mental issues, but it is not as if the presentation of mental issues issues are inherently incomprehensible, least of all within the realm of fiction, where such potentially sensitive and personal issues should, in theory, be most approachable. TOGA supposedly loves these characters, but when their core values shine in ways that defy and or condemn her approach to things, she shuts down. TOGA would then begin to recall the words of her parents as they question why she could not just be normal, and furthermore, they're pleased with her to simply live a normal life. How the late Curious considered her to be a pitiful creature, and finally, the words of URARAKA as she declared that if you want to live as you please, then you better be prepared to face the consequences. From which point we would see TOGA with a new look in her eyes. She would come to the conclusion that DEKU and URARAKA were the same like her parents, and here, the two of them simultaneously came to the conclusion that TOGA has just completely snapped. Now, TOGA has always been crazy, so that is definitely saying something. But nevertheless, I find myself questioning why. I really don't think either of them said anything that was wrong. They may not be what TOGA wants to hear, but they are not inherently wrong. With URARAKA, yeah, living as you please most definitely comes at a cost. Even in a context beyond criminal acts, these are still the facts. Every decision has an expense, no matter how minor or major. Cause and effect. These are the fundamental concepts which outline our understanding of our reality itself. With DEKU, this man just made it clear that he does not think about hurting people he cares about. DEKU didn't even say he's not into her or anything like that. His initial response was to question the plausibility of what he envisions a relationship to be and how exactly she would fit into it, followed by the defining of their personal desires and boundaries. Very simple and very respectful. And if TOGA put even a shred of thought into who DEKU is and the values he holds dear on her quest to be like him, this is a reality she would not have much difficulty in uncovering. I definitely want to feel as empathetic towards TOGA's mental struggles as I am to them when she is isolated and or by her lonesome, but regrettably when placed in relation to other characters, I feel like things just don't seem to really land, but oh well. Somehow, out of what DEKU just said about his personal thought process, TOGA came to the conclusion that they all think that only heroes and those they save are valued as people, as she went into full-on battle mode, that the rest do not even matter to them. And of course, she is still upset about the death of Twice at the hands of a hero, despite having killed scores of people herself. But I'm really not sure how she got all that from what either of these two said. Now, TOGA was most definitely about that action here, as DEKU not only noticed that her face was incredibly sad just then, but based on the paneling, it would seem as though his danger sense quirk has finally been able to detect her, which means that yeah, just like that, TOGA's deranged love for him is gone. How very fickle. DEKU would repel each of TOGA's attacks as she prepared to cut him, only for URARAKA to join in, calling out to her. URARAKA would grab hold of TOGA, telling her that ever since she met her, particularly in the case of the First War, she could not stop thinking about her. But in quick retort, TOGA would let it be known that she was not going to think of URARAKA anymore, and that she is done with her. That she only thought of DEKU, but now she's done with him too. That if the world does nothing but reject her, she's entitled to do the very same to the world. So TOGA was now a vengeful former admirer. And the now rocket-powered tendril-like weaponry of TOGA would begin racing towards URARAKA from behind, taking her attention elsewhere as TOGA readied her knife, expressing her disappointment. TOGA would then cut her, as she said she thought URARAKA at least would be understanding considering the two of them are the same. And by that, I'm going to presume she means as those who like DEKU. But at the same time, DEKU would grab hold of TOGA with Black Whip, and Sue would deliver a mean kick. And with this incredible entrance, she would apologize for being late. DEKU would question if URARAKA was alright considering she had just been stabbed, and she would confirm that she was, saying that the wound was only skin deep, which is somewhat ironic. She would also express a need to take that knife from TOGA since her blood was now on it. Sue would then admit to TOGA being one of their most unpredictable enemies, then coming to the conclusion that sending her to this faraway island was indeed the right call. TOGA would then realize that she not only managed to cut something, but that Sue had gotten involved in yet another one of her lover's quarrels. Sue would then tell DEKU to leave, and that this was no place to be talking about romance, which is funny considering how many times Sue has been involved in these sorts of situations with TOGA, and may furthermore serve to express that we will not be seeing any romantic developments in the series until it is all just about over and done with. Now, admittedly, TOGA's renouncement of her love, and furthermore the definition of her love in a sense, may perhaps serve as a major nerf to her abilities. Because she no longer loves URARAKA and DEKU, even if she were to have their blood, it's not as if she should be able to use their quirks on account of the prerequisite of said feelings. And in regards to wanting to be one and the same with someone, I know she has his blood, but has TOGA ever really wanted to be one and the same with Twice? All I can imagine at this point would be a post-mortem longing of sorts, since such a thing was never the case prior. But anyways, Sue would then speak of them all sticking to the original plan, that they would rely on URARAKA, who presently had the most encounters with TOGA, letting DEKU know that he should not worry, that they will take care of things on this front. And to further corroborate this, URARAKA would then call and turn to DEKU, telling him to go deal with Shigaraki. Deku would then recall her prior sentiments about the two of them being oddballs and their desire to help people despite them being labeled villains. And with a reassuring smile, the likes of which even All Might failed to encapsulate in the midst of his greatest hardships, URARAKA would let Deku know that they have got this. From which point, rising from the water like a monster would be Toga, questioning why life was so hard despite her loving so much, which would prompt URARAKA to further urge Deku to run. And man, I am loving this support item upgrade Toga has got going on. She is suddenly way more lethal, and speaking of lethality, recognize that she at the moment has 2 vials strapped to her leg, one of which we know to house the nation collapsing power of twice, and the other, well, I'd imagine the blood of someone else she loves would be the most valuable in this situation, considering she would then be able to use their quirk, although that is not outright a necessity. Not exactly sure whose that might be unless she quickly bottled URARAKA's up, which as expressed previously does bring up some logistical questions, but whatever. Not to mention that she just got back up on her feet, so the blood likely was not saved in such a way just yet, despite the likelihood of it being used at some point or another, since it has been obtained by her. Now there is the ever so slight potential of it belonging to Stain on account of his Tartarus-based incarceration and its subsequent liberation by way of Shigaraki and All For One, but I would not hold my breath. The final possibility being Sue, as again, she is low-key a reoccurring presence among these battles against Toga, and when they first met in the forest, Toga actually managed to cut Sue's tongue, and we have yet to see her transform into her just yet. However, following the advice of his peers, Deku would hit the dash and run away from this battlefield and off towards the one that has Shigaraki, and hopefully he gets there before things get too bad. When it comes to convincing villainous figures to do the right thing and or saving them, following his decision to do so in the case of Shigaraki, Deku hasn't exactly done a great job. And it seems like now we can add Toga to the failure list, although URARAKA is likely to be the one who's going to deal with that one. Although to be fair, the prospect of Blade and Nagan and Overhaul lending their expertise may serve to make all the difference at a very vital point. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.